scholars. However, given that betrothal interpretation came into being on the assumption that the Erasmian exception clause faithfully represented the mind of Jesus, godly men instinctively sensed that Jesus would never allow divorce for lawful marriage. They had to find some way that would allow them to retain no divorce on any grounds and yet allow the exception to stand. The solution was found in the customs of the Jews, whereby it was possible to get a divorce before one was married. This custom was unique to the Jews, for the Greeks and the Romans had nothing exactly like it. The fact that only Matthew carried this exception, which was written to and for the Jews, lent further credence to their belief that they had stumbled on the key to the exception clauses in Matthew. The fact that Joseph availed himself of this custom to divorce Mary, his espoused wife, clinched the argument in favor of their interpretation they held. And you should say, maybe these aren't, malevolent people. They were trying to say, okay, A, I believe God protects his book. B, this is what his book says. C, that kind of seems to be problematic. D, what should we do? How are we going to sort it out? How can we make sense of it? And this is what they came up with. So maybe not. Maybe they didn't know. Maybe they didn't know about the Erasmus era of 1516. So the question was asked, did Jesus make an exception for fornication? According to the New King James Version, the answer is yes. But according to the Greek text behind the New King James Version, the answer is no. Hi everyone, welcome back to SS4M. We're glad to have you. Today I'm going to be looking at the betrothal view as you saw in the description. So this is an interesting topic. For example, I'll give a couple lead-in stories. One, I had someone giving me a number of different comments, trying to get me to go back and look at some of the passages from Deuteronomy, Exodus, about some of the capital punishments that were associated with sex outside of marriage or adultery for married folks. And I wasn't exactly sure what I was supposed to take away from all that. But sometimes you'll hear these things. You'll maybe feel a little bit confused. What are people trying to say? How do I put all these verses together? I think this article will help clear some of that up, or at least address some of that. Also, maybe you've had a friend like one of mine who said, well, I'm in the betrothal camp. And I thought, what does that mean? What does he mean? And so one of the things that's tough for people, Christians, that are looking at, is it okay to remarry post-divorce, or should I divorce if I'm not in a happy marriage or whatever? How should I go about this? Is that we hear all kinds of different stuff, opinions, ideas, some secular, some like quasi-Christian, or at least there's like a verse and maybe a chapter, or somebody said, well, Pat Robertson said this or that or whatever. And so we're thinking, well, what? So here's why I think this is good. Fornication versus adultery. Why are people making such a big deal about these terms? Who cares? What does that matter? Why say that fornicators is a sin of the unmarried, while adultery is a sin just for married people? Why do we care about that? One thing about this view, the betrothal view, is we end up with two wives. How can you have two wives? Like, you have wives as in normal married people, women who have husbands, the normal definition of wife. But then we will also have these weird kind of soon-to-be wives or engaged women who are going to be called wives. Well, why? Why would they do that? Well, it's necessary in order to kind of make their point. Also, we have this issue that comes up from time to time that I'm in fact still a bit trying to sort out myself. Moses versus Jesus. If everything we found in the Old Testament was inspired by God and Moses wasn't running his own show, he was actually doing what God told him, then when you come to Jesus and he has these, you've heard it said this, but I say this, these six, I might go as far as to call them changes, though that might not be right, but some people call them antitheses, but there's six of them in the Beatitudes. So in Matthew 7, you can go and check those out. You've heard it said this, but I say this, and so it's this new teaching. What are we to make of that? Does that mean that the old wasn't real? Does it mean that Jesus didn't actually fulfill all the law, or not fulfill all the law? The part I'm referring to is, did he change it? Did he abolish any part of it? He said he wasn't going to do that. Well, Is that what he was doing there? How do we make sense of those? This article is going to help us look at that. I'm going over here to page 251, and I think I'll start with this as an opening. You can see this is quite long, and it hopefully won't take me that long, but it is like 60 pages that I went through. So I'm going to try to break it down, hit the highlights, and give you guys the best of the best. Of course, you can check it out on your own. I'll leave the link in the description. It says the moment a supporter of the betrothal view says that Mary committed adultery before they came together, in that admission, the solution degenerates into thin air. Supporters are not allowed to say that. They must keep to the party lines that she committed fornication, not adultery. Only if Joseph got a divorce for fornication can the exception clause be made to apply to his case. If he got a divorce for adultery, then the exception clauses cannot be restricted to engaged wives. I like engaged women, but whatever, engaged wives. The clauses must then apply to all wives, engaged and married. This is not the outcome that the supporters of the betrothal solution want to see come about. So that's the opening, and we're going to really get into it. The other thing I was going to mention was we're going to look at Erasmus, a review. I did another video on him, which I got from this writer, Leslie McFall, the late Leslie McFall. Super lot of thinking that this gentleman has done. Can only assume that he walked through this whole mess of divorce himself, but we'll see. So, reading the highlights from the abstract critique of the betrothal view. This is from what page are we on? 272. The biblical teaching of divorce and remarriage. Leslie McFall. Okay, so from the top. From the rabbinic literature came the revelation that during the espousal period, an engaged couple were regarded as husband and wife. This is confirmed in Matthew 1:19, where Joseph is called the husband of Mary in Matthew 1:19, and she is called his quote-unquote wife by the angel of the Lord. I think we're going to see later that this term wife does not exist in early languages. They just had woman, but we'll see. We'll see how I do. By demonstrating that Jesus distinguishes between two types of divorces, one before and the other after the marriage ceremony, this interpretation argued that the exception clauses related only to divorce before the marriage, and that there could be no divorce once the marriage was consummated, unless, of course, it was discovered that the bride was not a virgin on her wedding night, and that she ceased to be so prior to the marriage during the espousal period in the case of Mary. So they talk a lot about Mary and Joseph because that's what most people refer to. So yeah, if she loses her virginity to some other guy, or even I would assume yes, or her husband before the marriage, then no good. So and we'll see how that plays out later too. They address that scenario. So the pros and cons of the betrothal interpretation. The beauty about the betrothal interpretation is that it defends the indissolubility of every lawful consummated marriage. I remember what I was going to say. You guys remember how we've looked at other times what do we do with this problem where you have Mark and Luke, their gospel, saying if anyone divorces his wife or spouse and marries another, he commits adultery. Flat out. Two gospels. Then you turn over to Matthew and you have this exception clause coming out of nowhere. Changes everything. We're going to look at that as well because that's one of the problems that the betrothal view is trying to fix. It's trying to address. It's trying to say, well, this is how. It's because there's something Jewishness about the authors or the audience of Matthew's gospel. It has something to do with their rituals based upon marriage at that time, and so it must certainly be something about Jewish culture. That's why these other authors didn't get to it. So that's one important thing. So he says it's beautiful because it defends the indissolubility of every lawful consummated marriage. The evil consequence of the betrothal interpretation is that it makes Jesus the administrator of divorce. Even though it is given under exceptional circumstances akin to the incestuous solution, it is nevertheless, argue its supporters, a lawful divorce that Jesus thoroughly approved of, because his earthly father contemplated using this exceptional provision when he planned to divorce his espoused wife Mary. This provision of divorce had to go through the Jewish law courts to be valid. So, under special circumstances, divorce is good. God loves this kind of divorce, proclaim the supporters of the betrothal interpretation. It'll become very, very clear, if it hasn't already, that this author does not support the betrothal view at all. But I had this resource. I didn't know what it was. I'm like many of you guys. I'm trying to sort this out. I'm trying to look at people who are more educated and smarter and good at all this stuff. This guy wrote, 600 pages. So let's see what he has to say. Moving on. Advocates of the betrothal view assert that this practice of nullifying an unconsummated marriage during the betrothal period because of unfaithfulness is the event in view in the Matthean exception clause. One can understand that Christians who hold to the inerrancy of Scripture would seek out a solution that would allow Jesus to be consistent in his teaching on divorce as stated clearly in Mark 10 and Luke 16. This is highly commendable. But if the exception clause in Matthew 19:9 has been tampered with and a Greek word added to Jesus' words to make him allow for divorce for fornication, then it is wrong to defend the tampered text as representing what Jesus taught. The added word must be removed in order to recover the original words that Jesus actually used in conveying his teaching. Now, since the days of Moses, that first bit, that's all Erasmus, the change he made. We'll get to it if you're not familiar with it. Moving on. Since the days of Moses, no Hebrew or Jew had been allowed by God to obtain a divorce for fornication or adultery. God chose the severest penalty available to him to get rid of such defiled persons. The only grounds that Hebrews and Jews had been using to get a divorce since the time of Moses were for non-fornication issues. So, she burnt the toast, I don't like her, she's whatever, non-fornication issues. But Jesus referred directly to these grounds and declared that all such divorces were now null and void. Anything outside fornication was no longer a ground for divorce. He was asked, quote, "Is it lawful?" end quote, and he answered clearly, "It is not lawful to divorce for a non-fornication issue. My Father made it unlawful to divorce for fornication issues." God, in the person of the Lord Jesus, abolished the practice of divorce on the planet Earth for all time to come, and restored the original standard by which all men and women will be judged in the last day. According to the betrothal solution, one cannot say that Jesus banned all divorce under all circumstances. Jesus has room for this kind of divorce within his teaching. He has given permission to Jews who are in a marriage contract and whom he regards as husbands and wives, even though the consummation of their marriage is still up to 1 year in the future, to divorce one another if one of them commits fornication. It says he does not allow them to divorce on any other grounds, apart from the single sin. This means that their engagement vows are unbreakable, that they must go through with the marriage, that Jesus would put the full weight of his authority behind this special case. This exception to his quote-unquote no divorce on any grounds has alarming implications. First implication being, it means that Jesus' name is associated with divorce and it has his approval. Second, it means that divorce per se is not a word to be associated with sin. Third, on the betrothal interpretation, there are now good divorces and there are bad divorces. The betrothal view demands that the term wife should apply to a woman before and after consummation for the exception clauses to function. The betrothal vows have got to be as binding as the marriage vows. Reference Deuteronomy 27 and 24:5. He writes in italics, "This is absolutely crucial if the exception is to work. But the more one argues for equality between the betrothal state and the married state, the wider becomes the logical gap in allowing the betrothal quote-unquote wife to lose her wifely status for infidelity, but not allowing it in the case of the married wife. If betrothal were the same as marriage, then why would the couple still need to be married?" Hence, the procedure of divorce does do what it claims to do, namely, it dissolves a lawful union of husband and wife. So here, in the thinking of the betrothal view, it dissolves the marriage. And Jesus, it is claimed, agreed that divorce procedure truly dissolves unconsummated marriages because of unfaithfulness. Consequently, it is argued that what God has joined together in holy matrimony in an espousal marriage, quote-unquote marriage, he can dissolve through the law courts of this world. The question naturally arises, if God does this for unfaithfulness in the pre-consummation period, why would he not do the same in the post-consummation period? So you're starting to see there's a little bit of a domino effect. Pretty interesting. But let's keep going. He's saying, we noted above that the betrothal vows have got to be as binding as the marriage vows. Again, in italics, this is absolutely crucial if the exception is to work. The reason for this insistence by the supporters of the betrothal solution is this. When Jesus commences his statement, he uses the term, quote-unquote, his wife, and this must include espousal and married wives. He is addressing both types of wives, and this term wife, it is an inclusive term in this context, we are told. Now, if we omit the exception clause, the text would apply to both types of wives and would read, quote, now I say to you that who, for instance, may have divorced his wife, espousal or married, and may have married another woman, he becomes adulterous by marrying her. And the man having married a divorced wife, he becomes adulterous by marrying her. Now, if Jesus made no distinction between these wives in different stages of becoming potential mothers, then it logically follows that if, say, Joseph obtained a bill of divorce to dissolve his union with Mary because of her fornication or her loss of virgin status, then no man can marry her without being condemned by Jesus as an adulterer. We are told that it was to allow the innocent espoused husband, in this case Joseph, to find another wife that Jesus inserted the exception clause. So that's not what I ever thought of, I don't think, if you imagine that that's what this verse was referring to about people that were, engaged to be married, betrothed to be married, and that's what the exception clause was all about, then I don't know, you have a larger, wider imagination than I do. I don't think most of us would ever think that that's, I don't know what those verses were speaking of, but that's what this apparently is all based on. So we'll keep going. It's very dry. It's very dry here, you guys. Thanks for letting me drink some water. So moving on, the odd thing in this whole setup is that an espoused wife can be lawfully divorced on Jesus' expressed authority for the sin of fornication, but when a married wife commits the exact same sin of fornication, she cannot be divorced. Yet the theory places great emphasis on the belief that at the betrothal ceremony, the two are married in the eyes of the law. And so, binding is this union, we are informed that it takes a divorce certificate to get out of it. Playing up the permanency of the betrothal contract only heightens the nonsensical nature of not allowing married couples to be divorced on the same grounds of a broken contract. So, fourth, it says, Jesus hates fornication so much that when it occurs between two persons who are engaged to be married, the innocent party can sue for divorce with his full approval and blessing. But if fornication occurs after they've consummated their marriage, then the innocent party cannot sue for divorce. If he does get a divorce, it does not have God's, it says his, but capital H, his approval or blessing. The former is a just divorce, and the latter is an unjust divorce. Actually, just to be quite honest, I don't know, it's interesting. Fifth, in order to administer Jesus' special case divorce, Jesus would need to set up the equivalent of the Jewish Sanhedrin in his church to appoint judges to investigate each case. These judges would need a salary or stipend, secretaries, financial boards, and the whole paraphernalia that goes along with human law courts. Or are these privileged Jewish Christians to go to Satan's Gentile courts to obtain Jesus' special divorce certificates? So this is a great question. How I just never thought of it like this. It's really interesting. What are you saying? Jesus didn't set up anything like this. So how would this be administrated? Often it's not, but sometimes, I don't know, we try to get people from the outside to weigh in on the matters. Sixth, this quote-unquote special case divorce would not be available to Jesus' non-Jewish converts. And this is because, like I said in the beginning, it's Matthew, his audience is the Jews. The Gentiles didn't have this long, drawn-out situation. So basically, Jesus discriminates between his Jewish followers and his Gentile followers, and he cares more for one than the other because the Gentiles would be basically stuck, because they probably wouldn't find out. No, it wouldn't be that they wouldn't find out. They would find out at the same time. But basically, there's a provision for the betrothal, folks. Seventh, in effect, the vows that the Christian Jews make at the traditional prenuptial stage are the same vows that Christian Gentiles make on the day of their traditional way of becoming husband and wife. The only difference is that the Christian Jew has a longer period of time between making the vows and consummating the marriage. In the case of Gentile Christians, bringing forward the prenuptial vows to within a few hours of the point at which these vows are consummated does not allow any time for the bride or groom to commit fornication. But even if, God forbid, one of the parties commits fornication between making the vows in the morning and consummating the marriage in the evening, it can be proved that fornication has taken place. And it can be proved that fornication has taken place. And it can be proved that fornication has taken place. Jesus does not allow this Gentile couple to sue for divorce on the grounds of fornication because he discriminates between his Jewish and his non-Jewish followers. It follows from this that if one of the Gentile parties is guilty of fornication before the marriage is consummated, Jesus' attitude toward the innocent Gentile party is to say, hard luck. But you have to live with your guilty partner for the rest of your life because I have not given you the option that I have given to my Jewish followers to sue for a divorce and to extricate themselves from a defiled relationship. So he says, let us be clear. In the case of Jewish Christian weddings, because there is a longer period of time between making the vows and consummating the marriage, if one of the parties commits fornication in that time, then the innocent party can sue for a divorce, but only if they are Jewish, because the exception is found only in the gospel that was specifically written to the Jews. He says it much better than I do, but now you're starting to see it. Yes, it's becoming very interesting. Eighth, one would have to question the wisdom of Jesus, who had the foresight to realize that God's will for marriage predated Moses' approval of severing marriages. He displayed his supernatural wisdom when he took his disciples back to Genesis 2:24 instead of going to Deuteronomy 24, 1-3. This insight is highly commendable, but in the case of his quote-unquote special case divorce, he took up a tradition that Moses did not institute, which has no legal foundation in God's Torah, and which was imposed on God's people by the rabbis. And then Jesus goes along with the whole thing. But not only does he go along with it, but he actually incorporates it into his set of doctrine. So the rabbis created their own law with no authority from God, and Jesus meekly fell in behind these rabbis and gave his approval to their new man-made law. We're entitled to ask, what was the point of rescuing this man-made, post-Mosaic, Johnny-come-lately custom to divorce an unmarried couple? When his doctrine of forgiveness stated that all adultery and all fornication committed after a marriage had been consummated had to be forgiven, and that he would not make any special provision for divorce for sexual sins committed by married persons. The position that the supporters of the betrothal solution have put Jesus in is ludicrous. It makes him look like a fool, taking his lead from blind leaders of the blind. Elsewhere, Jesus has nothing but contempt for the quote-unquote tradition of the elders. But in this case, he was blindsided and didn't see it coming. If we are to believe that the betrothal solution is the only solution to the so-called exception clauses in Matthew's gospel. So 11th, everyone can see that an engagement is an engagement and not a one flesh union. So it's quite obvious. He goes on, but it is obvious to all her family and his family that the engagement does not make them husband and wife, though they experience in their hearts that something has happened to their singleness, and this is recognized by God in Scripture because he treats the engaged virgin differently from the one who is not engaged. So Deuteronomy 21:13-29 is basically a section that talks about fornication by, it's basically sexual activity by a woman who is not engaged, and why she would be put to death versus the one who is engaged, and why these are different. Okay, so Deuteronomy, it's actually 22:13-29 instead of, it's just off one chapter here. So Deuteronomy 22 on the screen. And it basically just says that there's some different outcomes depending upon engagement or non-engagement. But anyway, so it says one would expect that Jesus would see that the engaged couple were not yet husband and wife. Why then does it require a divorce certificate to break off an engagement promise when the two are not yet one flesh? Gentile Christians do not need to go to a law court to get a divorce certificate to end their engagement and to retrieve the engagement ring. They do what Joseph did to Mary. They put her away privately. End of engagement, end of story, move on, get another girlfriend. Excuse me. It exposes a weakness in his claim to be God's. So if Jesus went along with all this, then it exposes a weakness in his claim to be God's supreme teacher, that he would fall for such a noose of a tradition as to regard the engagement to be so binding that it can only be severed or dissolved by using the same divorce certificate with the same wording as if the engaged couple were a one flesh union. So 12th, Moses never instituted divorce for engaged couples. God never instituted divorce for engaged couples. But Jesus, we are told, instituted divorce for engaged couples. Or rather, was it done for him by the rabbis before he was born, and he unthinkingly took up their tradition and incorporated it permanently into his body of teaching. It goes on, but you can see the problem there. Jesus said, whoever divorces his wife, ... But you might be thinking, which wife are you referring to? The Pharisees could have asked, engaged wives or married wives? But Jesus continued, whoever divorces his wife, except for fornication, the word except, we are told, creates two classes of wives. And the word fornication, we are told, is a sin that only engaged wives or singles could commit. So it is obvious we are informed that Jesus is talking about two different kinds of wives, and that what he says about married wives committing adultery if they remarry does not imply to engaged wives. They can get a divorce, and they can become the engaged wife of another man, while the first quote-unquote husband is still alive without committing adultery. We are told that Jesus was siding with the rabbis in order to protect these engaged husbands from the charge of committing adultery after they divorced their quote-unquote wives, which the tradition obliged them to do, using the exact same divorce certificate that was used to divorce a married couple. In effect, the betrothal interpreters hold that what Jesus is doing is robbing the married man of his Mosaic right to divorce his married wife for fornication, but allowing the engaged man his new rabbinic right to divorce his engaged wife for fornication, which new right was unlawful because death, not divorce, was the lawful punishment for her fornication. In Deuteronomy 22:21. And there you can see they got the chapter right. But it's really interesting. Truth be told, where I've kind of been coming before this, before I read it, and even probably right now in this moment, is that capital crime stuff seems totally ludicrous. I mean, especially for today. Of course, we're trying to figure out what does this mean for 2020? What does this mean for our generation? How are we going to think through this? I mean, no one's going to put to death our spouses. This isn't, I mean, no one wants that anyway. So, I mean, I don't need, that sounds very judgmental. That's, I guess, what God put forth beforehand. We don't see that in the New Testament. So what, how are you thinking what I'm thinking? What are we going to do here? Where are we going with this? A little confused. 13th, there is a logical and moral inconsistency in Jesus giving permission to divorce an engaged wife for sexual infidelity before she is married, but not after she's married. I think this is a good point. This makes a lot of sense. If fornication is wrong before marriage, then it's wrong after marriage. What's the difference? The act of fornication and its heinousness is exactly the same whether it is carried out before or after the marriage has become a reality. 14th, there is a logical and moral inconsistency in Jesus' punishing an unfaithful but engaged wife with divorce and punishing an unfaithful married wife with death. Jesus allied himself fully with the rabbis when he too called the engaged woman a quote-unquote wife. However, the rabbis were more consistent than Jesus, because if an engaged wife committed a sexual offense, they did not call it fornication as Jesus did, but they rightly called it adultery because she was a wife, quote-unquote wife. Again, the author doesn't believe she was really a wife, but whatever. Because the sin was adultery, the rabbis rightly demanded the death penalty. Jesus, we are told, reduced their punishment to divorce when he used the term except in the so-called exception clause in Matthew 19. He says it's so-called because, again, he's going to say that Erasmus changed the Bible. We have not done a good job in bringing it back to what we know is a more accurate translation, so we're stuck with this exception clause. As it may read here, whoever divorces his wife except for fornication, ... it goes on, end quote. This, we are told, gave the engaged husband the right to divorce his engaged wife for fornication. The engaged husband or her father should have stoned her, but Jesus gave him permission to reduce it to divorce. Jesus left himself open to the charge that, quote, this was not so from the beginning, because God demanded that both the engaged wife and the married wife, if found guilty of infidelity to their husbands, were stoned to death. On what authority, then, did Jesus overrule God and change the death penalty into a divorce penalty in the case of engaged wives? The betrothal solution puts Jesus and God on a collision course over the punishment that is to be meted out to the engaged wife. Jesus preferred to side with the rabbis and oppose God. This is an unforeseen evil consequence of adopting the betrothal solution. It has been thought through. It has not been thought through in a rigorous manner. I'm going to read this one. 15. Supporters of the betrothal solution of the Matthean acceptive clause sleep safely in their beds knowing that Jesus instituted divorce only for engaged Jewish couples. They feel secure knowing that Christians in the West cannot get their hands on this special case divorce certificate. But what they have not realized is that once Jesus made an exception for divorce for engaged Jewish converts, that this provision automatically became a permanent fixture in his teaching on divorce and remarriage. This means that as more and more Jews turn to Christ and congregate in Messianic churches, and who are determined to carry into those congregations all the trappings of their rich Hebrew or Jewish religion, they will return to their marriage traditions. Now, if they discover that Jesus, their Messiah, has granted them permission to divorce their wives and to divorce their engaged wives and engaged husbands for sexual immorality Now, if they discover that Jesus, their Messiah, has granted them permission to divorce their engaged wives and engaged husbands for sexual immorality during the espousal period, they will be emboldened by the betrothal solution to reintroduce these special type divorces into their congregations because they are the special people of God, set apart from their Gentile brothers and sisters in Christ, with a sense of pride in their Jewishness. They can point out that there is an exception clause to be added to Paul's statement, quote, that there is neither Jew nor Gentile in Christ, we are all one, end quote. No, says the modern Christian Jew, Jesus has given us divorce, which he has not given to you Gentiles, and the supporters of the betrothal solution will have to agree with them. We are not all one. Jesus has erected a wall of partition between Jew and Gentile over the issue of divorce during the espousal period. They can get a divorce, but Gentiles cannot. This is one of the unforeseen consequences of the betrothal solution. So Mark and Luke were written for Gentile Christians, and these Gospels make no provision for the special case divorce to be on offer to them. It is only on offer to Jewish Christians, and this is why it appears only in Matthew's Gospel. 16th, the supporters of the betrothal view made themselves hostages to fortune when they declared that the word fornication could only mean premarital sex, and that no married person could commit fornication. This is based on ignorance of the fact. Married persons can fornicate and be fornicators, as well as be adulterous and adulterers and adulteresses. 17th, the betrothal interpretation is based on the wrong Greek text. It's based on Erasmus's faulty Greek text. The truth is that once you remove the Greek word that Erasmus added to God's word in Matthew 19:9, the exception clause, except for fornication, disappears, and the reason for the existence of the betrothal interpretation disappears. So again, this is nice. I like this one because he's really telling us, why does the betrothal view even exist? It exists in order to reconcile Matthew's gospel with Luke's and Mark's. How are we going to make sense of this exception clause, and yet at the same time still hold that all consummated marriages, normal consummated marriages, are indissoluble except through death? How are we going to write those two? How are we going to bring that together? And that's what the betrothal view attempts to do. But he says it doesn't need to if we go back to the proper scriptures. 18th, the betrothal interpretation gives the same translation to the so-called acceptive clause in Matthew 5:32 and 19, verse 9, namely, except for fornication, despite the fact that the Greek prepositions are different in both places. And he'll get to that in a little bit. 20th, the supporters of the betrothal solution would prefer to translate Matthew chapter 19, verse 9 as follows. Now I say to you that who, for instance, may have divorced his wife, except for betrothal fornication, which is punished by death, and may have married another woman, he becomes adulterous by marrying her. And the man, having married a divorced wife, he becomes adulterous by marrying her. But why would Jesus single out betrothal fornication when the same death penalty applies to it and to adultery? To justify God's death penalty, the solution requires that the premarital fornication be committed after the couple have entered into the espousal period, but before the marriage is consummated, because only if she can be viewed as a wife could she receive the punishment that belongs to adulteresses. 21. Under point 3 above, we noted that the betrothal solution required the following translation. Now I say to you that who, being a married man, for instance, may have divorced his wedded wife, except for the espoused husband who divorced his espoused wife for betrothal fornication, which is punished by death, and he, going back to the married people, he, a truly married man, may have married another woman, he becomes adulterous by marrying her, and the man having married a divorced wife, he becomes adulterous by marrying her. The switch from focusing on married couples in 19 verse 9, the first part A, to addressing betrothal couples in the exception clause, and then switching back to married couples in the end of verse 9 is not good grammar. The implication of the exception clause is that Jesus taught that if a betrothed husband divorced his betrothed wife, it could only be for fornication and nothing else. This meant that his betrothal, when once established in law and custom, is a permanent union, meaning all the days of his life, and he cannot get out of it on any other grounds, not even using the hate option of Deuteronomy 24, 1-3. It becomes an indissoluble betrothal bond. So that's what they're needing to get us to try to understand or believe or go along with. So at what point does God recognize a Jewish marriage to be a permanent union? Supporters of the betrothal interpretation who want Jesus to create an exception for divorce in the case of an unfaithful espoused bride do so on the grounds that, quote, the first stage of betrothal of marriage was the legal part, and far more important than the second stage, the marriage. Because of this, they argue that it is at the betrothal stage that the espoused bride becomes a wife before consummation occurs. I just highlighted that because, I've never heard of anything like this. Paul recognized that it was the consummated act itself that constitutes a male and a female one flesh, because going into a prostitute created a one flesh union via a consummated act, but this union was a sinful act. So you guys should know the verse when Paul talks about that in the New Testament. So should the bride be found not to be a virgin in the gap between the betrothal and the marriage ceremony or at consummation, God demands that she should be killed. Since the unfaithful betrothed bride is punished with the same punishment that is meted out to a married woman, then neither can be divorced. And if neither can be divorced, then Jesus makes no exception for unfaithful betrothed brides to be divorced. Therefore, Jesus' teaching on no divorce for any reason is his permanent teaching on the subject. I can't tell if this is the author's opinion at this point or if he's speaking as if he is one who is, in the betrothal camp. I think he's speaking of his own opinion. So, because he says the relationship between Jesus and his church is likened to the Jewish custom of marriage, in the husband to be Jesus, who purchases his bride, the church, with a bride price, his own blood, and no other man can take her from him. She now belongs to him. But between purchase and the marriage feast itself, there is a gap. And it is a gap that constitutes the present era of grace. It is a period fraught with danger for the espoused wife, the church, because while her espoused husband, the Lord Jesus, will remain faithful to her throughout the gap period, there is no guarantee that she will remain faithful to him during the same period, and the marriage feast may yet be called off, and the consummation never occur. On the other hand, if she remains faithful to him, then she has the assurance in her heart that she can never be sent away by him. And what applies to the church will apply to every Christian who knows that they have been purchased by the precious blood of the Lord Jesus. The individual Christian is called upon to remain faithful and obedient to the headship of the Lord Jesus, to be totally submissive to do his will, and have eyes only for him and his interest as they make their way through the time gap that separates betrothal from marriage and consummation in heaven to be with the Lord forever. Whew. So I like that just in and of itself, but it really also makes his point on how he sees things. So the way forward to a new solution. He's going to talk about what we need is a new solution that divorces Jesus from divorce, is what he says. The new solution must associate every occurrence of the word divorce with sin. The betrothal view, has this good divorce and bad divorce kind of thing. The distinction must be abolished in this new solution. 3, the new solution must take into account the linguistic evidence that the term fornication cannot be restricted simply to premarriage sex. This, he says, is really the linchpin that holds the betrothal theory together. The evidence is clear that a married person can be fornicators, and that they can fornicate just as they can be prostitutes and prostitute themselves. The term fornicate and prostitute go back to the same root. So, and he's going to go quite into detail. I think he finds 10 or more situations where a married person is doing some other kind of fornication, and it's called fornication. Basically, the idea is that fornication is a broad, overarching term, and adultery would be a subcategory of that broader category. So, the new solution must be based on the majority Byzantine Greek New Testament published by Robertson and Pierpont, which has removed Erasmus's edition of the EI and the UN in Matthew 19:9. The removal of this word will remove the exception clause altogether in Matthew 19:9. The solution must come to terms with the different Greek words used in the so-called acceptive clauses in Matthew 5:32 and 19:9. It is a common failing of works supporting the betrothal solution that they ignore these differences, because behind them Jesus is making two separate points. It goes on, the new solution must take into account that Jesus is referring to one and the same wife in Matthew 5:32 and one and the same wife in Matthew 19:9, in accordance with the grammar of their respective sentences. This is a keynote of the betrothal solution, that Jesus is addressing two kinds of wives in both places. This is eisegesis, not exegesis. Seven, the new solution must not manipulate or distort the use of rabbinic material. For example, the rabbis regarded the engaged wife as in the same category as a married wife, whose infidelity is called adultery and is punished with death. But in the betrothal solution, this information is disregarded, and in its place they regard the engaged wife as really a single person, and so her infidelity is called fornication, which it is in Deuteronomy 22:21, and her punishment is reduced to divorce, which it is not in Deuteronomy 22:21. So some inconsistency there you can see. They talk about, what's the deal with why was it so important that a bride be virgin? I think the sexual revolution, introduction of contraception, pretty much saw wide-scale sexual experimentation outside of marriage, and so that may be really weird to us. We might say, well, what is the big deal, especially as a capital crime? I would say, as an American, I just found that whoa, really? I mean, it just seems so countercultural from how we are. So the reason why a man had to marry a virgin in Israel was to ensure that every man's offspring could be tracked back to those whom great promises and covenants were made concerning possession of the land in Palestine and future inheritances. Only physical legitimate descendants could inherit these promises, and illegitimacy disqualified. So they go on and they talk about basically the line. They wanted to be able to show, did God keep his promise to the people or not? And so that's a lot. I'm not going to read that all for you, but it was pretty interesting. It says, where are we at here? It says the master and the husband use their will to do the will of Christ, who uses his will to do the will of God. So God will be seen to be all in all. The husband and the master serve Christ directly, not through some human intermediary. The male slave can move from serving Christ indirectly to serving him directly, if he can become free. The wife can never do this. All her married days she serves Christ indirectly through her ordained head. It is quality, not equality. It is quality, not equality, that Jesus looks for among the daughters of God. On that note, I would say that it's so important that couples see this thing the same way. If not, if both couples can't agree to those statements, for example, if she's not good with that part of marriage, and he doesn't expect that of her, or that's not what he thinks, or that's not what she thinks, that's not what they think, it's going to be a real nightmare. Matthew 16. So they talk about this, do this example where you see here the EI or the UN. Basically, this it was the same structure that Erasmus added, and it's not the only time we find it in Scripture. So, example, you can see a wicked and adulterous generation seeks after a sign, and no sign shall be given it except, right here, the sign of the prophet Jonah. But in Mark, it only says, why does this generation seek after a sign? Assuredly, I say to you, no sign shall be given this generation. And so they're basically using that to say, look, it's not the only time that we see this difference between Mark and Matthew. So it's kind of really interesting in the same sense of like, why, if you're going to make a record, why leave out such an important thing? It's two very different things to say. No sign will be given this generation versus no sign will be given this generation except the sign of Jonah. Very different. The second one, it's like one sign will be given them. The first one is like 0 signs will be given them. So that's a big difference. It says, what would Mark's readers make of this omission to mention the exception in Jesus' apparently absolute statement that the Jews would not be given a single sign, i.e. a demonstration of his miraculous powers? What looks like an absolute statement in Mark turns out to be not so, after all, because Matthew retained the exception clause except for Jonah the prophet. Is it not a parallel to the missing exception clause of Mark 10:9? Matthew retained the exception clause except for fornication, which Mark omitted. Many pro-divorce writers feel strongly that the exception clause in Matthew 19:9 should be in mind of the reader who reads Mark 10:16, Romans 7, 1 Corinthians 7. On the face of it, they have a strong case. Erasmus and the Protestant reformers argued cogently that all scripture passages about divorce must be interpreted in light of the unambiguous exceptions contained in Matthew's exception clauses, and it was very difficult for anyone to escape the logic that enclosed the minds of Europe at that time. What is damaging to this parallel is that while there is an exception statement in the Jonah passage, there is no exception in the case of Matthew's so-called exception clause. Here is where the breakdown occurs. However, supporters of the betrothal interpretation arrived at their solution in the distant past when Erasmus had changed the Greek of Matthew 19:9 to put in the exception clause, thus creating a direct parallel with the exception clause in the Jonah passage. The betrothal solution worked on the assumption that Jesus did make an exception for fornication, and they were puzzled to find something in Israel's laws that would allow Jesus to make an exception for fornication, and yet allow him to maintain that no consummated marriage could ever be dissolved. The solution lay in the situation that Mary and Joseph found themselves in. This scenario requires a separate section to unravel. See, should Mary have been executed? The point of this section is to show that betrothal interpretation arose out of a Greek text that was deliberately tampered with by Erasmus in order to get his interpretation of Jesus' teaching on divorce into the New Testament. He was a humanist, and he was determined to get Jesus to allow divorce for fornication. The reformers did not spot the trickery and were duped into accepting that Jesus permitted divorce for fornication. Those who support the betrothal solution have been similarly duped by Erasmus into accepting that Jesus did introduce an exception clause into his teaching on divorce. This work has exposed Erasmus's deception so that those who formerly supported the betrothal solution will quickly see through Erasmus's deception and go back to Matthew and remove Erasmus's exception clause and take a fresh stand on what Jesus did say about divorce and remarriage. So then the next section, did Jesus make an exception for fornication? Well, I think you already told us, but we'll see. It says almost all supporters of the betrothal interpretation follow the wording of the New King James Version when it comes to the so-called exception clause. This version followed the Greek text of Erasmus, who added the Greek word ei before the un at Matthew 19:9. So sorry for those of you who actually speak Greek, and for everyone else, that's probably not all how this is said, but that's just what I say. Ei, un, that's what it looks like. I don't know. I wasn't even in a fraternity, obviously, so okay, just have mercy. So, and by this small addition, he altered Jesus' exclusion of divorce on all grounds to one in which Jesus made an exception for fornication. These supporters never doubted that Matthew included an exception for fornication, but they were wrong. They were not in a position to even question the authorized version translation itself, such has been the low level of scholarship among them. Unfortunately, the New King James Version is no better than the Old King James Version because it translates the majority Byzantine text as if it were translating Erasmus's Greek text of 1516, but the majority text has rightly discarded Erasmus's addition of ei before un, yet the New King James Version retains the old exception clause, for it reads, "And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery." Given that a shift is occurring towards the acceptance of the majority Greek text of the New Testament as the nearest thing we are ever likely to get to the original autographed text itself, it is disturbing that the New King James Version perpetuates the Erasmian acceptive clause, which is not in the majority Greek text, nor is it in the Nestle Aland Greek text, 28th edition, which goes back to Westcott and Hort's 1881 Greek text, which was based on two isolated Egyptian manuscripts, both of which were in the state of degenerating into oblivion when they were rescued, but not before they lost a considerable portion of their text, which has to be supplied from later manuscripts. Evangelicals urgently need a revision of the New King James Version. However, given that betrothal interpretation came into being on the assumption that the Erasmian exception clause faithfully represented the mind of Jesus, godly men instinctively sensed that Jesus would never allow divorce for lawful marriage. They had to find some way that would allow them to retain no divorce on any grounds and yet allow the exception to stand. The solution was found in the customs of the Jews, whereby it was possible to get a divorce before one was married. This custom was unique to the Jews, for the Greeks and the Romans had nothing exactly like it. The fact that only Matthew carried this exception, which was written to and for the Jews, lent further credence to their belief that they had stumbled on the key to the exception clauses in Matthew. The fact that Joseph availed himself of this custom to divorce Mary, his espoused wife, clinched the argument in favor of their interpretation they held. And you should say it, maybe these aren't, malevolent people. They were trying to say, okay, A, I believe God protects his book. B, this is what his book says. C, that kind of seems to be problematic. D, what should we do? How are we going to sort it out? How can we make sense of it? And this is what they came up with. So maybe not. Maybe they didn't know. Maybe they didn't know about the Erasmus era of 1516. So the question was asked, did Jesus make an exception for fornication? According to the New King James Version, the answer is yes. But according to the Greek text behind the New King James Version, the answer is no. So he really says we have to sort this. I mean, we have to come to terms with what's what. And that is his point here and in other places. What are we looking at here? Does fornication in the Bible refer only to premarital sex? And so this is one of the things. Remember, they said that it was the linchpin. It had to be that in order for this whole thing to make sense, that it had to be, the beginning was talking about married people, the exception clause is talking about betrothed people, and then the end is talking about married people again. So Here we go. It says, as a consequence, all extramarital affairs by married persons are adultery, not fornication. And David Pawson talks like this. He talks, I don't know if he believes like this, but he makes a big point in order to say, hey, fornication is the sin of unmarried people, and adultery is the sin of married people. But this guy says, nuh-uh. They consider it a major linguistic blunder to say that fornication can include adultery, and two, that a married person cannot commit fornication. On these two presuppositions hang all their other arguments. Of the two, the linchpin is the second one. The espousal view can be summed up in one writer's words, including the square bracket words. Remember, he warns, it was except for fornication, meaning premarital sex, during the espousal period, prior to the marriage being consummated, that Matthew said one was free to remarry. Another writer wrote, could saving for fornication be premarital sex during the Jewish espousal period, making them free to divorce and remarry because they had not yet consummated the marriage? What this writer failed to notice was that if Jesus permitted an engaged wife to lose her virginity in the espousal period and was divorced by her prospective husband for her infidelity, how could she be married to another man if she was not a virgin? For every man had to marry a virgin. ? If she was found not to be virgin on her wedding night, then she would be stoned to death, not divorced. And Jesus is made to support this whole divorce thing. So this view makes a fool of Jesus, who is presented as being incapable of working through the logic of his position. Another writing, having followed the AV of Matthew 5:32, except it be for fornication, ask, what is fornication in this context? Is it having premarital sexual relations during the Jewish espousal or engagement period? Well, according to the Betrothal View, the primary definition of the word fornication, or porneia, is unlawful sexual intercourse by unmarried persons. And the primary definition of the word adultery, moakeia, is unlawful sexual intercourse by married persons. That, they claim, is the core distinction between the two terms, and since their solution rests on just two pillars, if the linguistic theory collapses, then the whole edifice also collapses. However, this rigid distinction between pre- and post-marital fornication and between married and unmarried persons is not sustainable on linguistic grounds. It's artificial. It is contrived in order to twist the argument in favor of the betrothal position. And so he goes on, he's going to talk about Clement. He says a better distinction for these two terms would be fornication by a married person has the characteristics of having sex without regard to the person cooperating and is impersonal and an effect and end in itself each time. Pure sexual self-gratification is the purpose of this promiscuous activity, whereas adultery has regard, romance, passion, whatever, sweet notes or whatever, whereas adultery would have those things as regard for the other person. It's personal, it's affectionate, and ongoing. So there's a relationship aspect to it. So he's going at talking about now in Jeremiah chapter 3 verse 1, the scenario that Yahweh describes is of a married woman who after her divorce was fornicating with numerous other males. This is a clear-cut case where a married woman can commit fornication. We see the same picture in 3:6 with regard to Yahweh's other wife, the 10 tribes of Israel, who were sent into exile. In chapter 3 verse 8, the married wife of Yahweh committed adultery, which is the correct word to use of a married person indulging in extramarital affairs. So he divorces her, the 10 tribes. Judah, Yahweh's other wife, saw what he did to his wife Israel, but she paid no heed and committed adultery and fornication against him. So there's another one. Tamar, your daughter-in-law, has committed fornication or prostitution. Also see she conceives through fornications. There's going to be a bunch of other examples that he gives, but basically he goes down and he says that basically the theory is the driving force behind the betrothal view, not the lexicons, not the dictionaries, and not grammar. So it says the moment a supporter of the betrothal view says that Mary committed adultery before they came together, in that admission the solution disintegrates into thin air. Supporters are not allowed to say that. They must keep to the party lines that she committed fornication. She was single, fornication. She was single is fornication, not adultery. Only if Joseph got a divorce for fornication can the exception clause be made to apply to this case. If he got a divorce for adultery, then the exception clause cannot be restricted to engaged wives. The clauses must then apply to all wives, engaged and married. And this is the only time he really blows it up into everybody. But if he so Joseph, only if Joseph got a divorce for fornication can the exception clause be made to apply to his case. Okay, so if we're going to read Erasmus's version of the Bible, and it explicitly says fornication, it explicitly says porneia, it doesn't say adultery, it says fornication, then for him to walk away from Mary, she would have had to been guilty of fornication. If he got a divorce for adultery, then the exception clauses cannot be restricted to engaged wives. The clauses must then apply to all wives, engaged and married. This is not the outcome that the supporters of the betrothal situation want to see come about. This would be a disaster for their position. They want to be, it had to be suppressed at all costs, and the best way to do this was to say nothing and hope that nobody would notice the inconsistency in their position. The supporters of the betrothal solution should come clean about the way they are picking and choosing to make their case stand up. First of all, they should acknowledge that the rabbinical literature in Matthew can call all espoused engaged women his woman. Second, they should acknowledge that rabbinical literature regarded infidelity and an espoused wife as adultery and not fornication. They can then place their cards on the table and say, if we accept that her sin should be called adultery, then our whole theory crashes to the ground. We cannot allow this to happen, so we are going to claim that Jesus decided to rewrite rabbinical literature and reclassify Mary's sin as fornication. If we had honesty to this degree, then the claim that Jesus, off his own bat, decided to reclassify his mother's infidelity as fornication could be examined to see what it was worth and whether the grammar or syntax or anything could deflect the change that the supporters of the betrothal interpretation have brought their theory to the text and imposed it on Jesus in order to extricate him and shield him from being a supporter of divorce for all cases, married and unmarried, involving fornication. So I guess these people, they want to stand up for forgiveness. If you're talking about truly married people, they believe that if there's adultery or some kind of sexual sin, maybe before the marriage, and I guess that would make a lot of sense, right? Because I mean, what if like you're talking about American congregations and you said, listen, anybody who is married here and both people weren't virgins, then this whole thing is nonsense. It's illegitimate. I mean, there wouldn't be very many people in the churches that would apply to. Very, very few, right? So then what, like, I don't know, 99% of people have illegitimate marriages? I mean, that's kind of crazy. So then they'd have to say, and then everyone could say, well, then I'll just divorce you. It's already illegitimate anyway. And so, if I don't like you or I'm not happy, so it's just like I already have my out. You fooled around at prom or something, and so now I don't have to stay with you. If I want to leave, then this is my, this is my get out of jail card or whatever you want to say it, however you want to say it. And so they would say, well, we don't want that to happen, so we have to protect all these consummated marriages. But then we have this exception clause, and how are we going to make it fit? How are we going to make sense of it? How can we do it? I guess that's basically, they're trying to protect most of the marriages and yet still be followers of the Bible that they have, the New King James, for example. Supporters of the betrothal situation are Supporters of the betrothal solution are against any supporter who claims that fornication may sometimes include adultery by extension, and that adultery may include cases where this is fornication. So I guess when I said that there was this overarching larger category called fornication, underneath it was adultery. No, they need it to be side by side, like two totally distinct categories. So, like one of the other examples about prostitution, prostitutes can be of any age and status, single, married, or divorced. The sin they commit is fornication. In the case of a married woman, their sin can also be called adultery. So, he just really, he's really trying to argue against this. He also goes and looks at this Greek, to study the Greek translation of the two key terms, fornication and adultery, in the Hebrew Bible show a very consistent equivalent translation of the two terms. They never confuse the translation terms. So you have fornication on the left, adultery on the right. Boom, 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 boom. It says that this guy E. Lovestam made a study of the Hebrew equivalent to porneia and found it was invariably the word zinut. He concluded that zinut covers all sexual scenes that porneia covers, and that both can be used about matters which come under the category of adultery. He wrote, as is the case in the Old Testament, where in many places, say like porneia or fornication with derivatives is used side by side with adultery with its derivatives to express the same thing. You have it in Hosea, Jeremiah, Ezekiel. If we turn to the rabbinic literature, the use of zana or porneia with its derivatives about a wife's unfaithfulness to her husband is well in evidence. In the following passage, fornication and adultery are directly related to each other. When a wife commits fornication, she is in the first instance false to her husband, and in the second place she is false to the Holy One. Blessed be he who has commanded her, thou shalt not commit adultery, and who says, both the adulterer and adulteress shall surely be put to death. This statement relates to the instructions about a wife suspected of adultery in Numbers. In rabbinic discussions about the possible unfaithfulness of a wife is often used. Here are just a few examples. And he goes on. But basically, Lovestam's claim that the verb for fornication is used about married wives in similar contexts in the writings of the rabbis. You can see that here. He did not exclude the possibility that she could marry a bachelor, in which case a single man can commit adultery as well as fornication. I think that's a great example. Yep, that makes perfect sense. An unmarried person sleeping with a married person makes sense. So it is clear from the above evidence that it can no longer be claimed that the term fornication is the prerogative sin of unmarried persons. And that follows, in what follows, let us change fornication into premarital sex for the sake of the argument in the following text and see what happens. So first, at the very first church council held in Jerusalem, the Apostle James suggested that the church should send out a decree to all the churches not to come under the yoke of the Mosaic law, and suggested that we write unto them that they abstain from all pollution of idols, and from premarital sex or fornication, and from things strangled, and from blood. Are we to believe that the council, in choosing to use the word fornication in verse 20 and 29, were addressing only unmarried young men and women and asking them to control their sexual urges before they got married? Were they not also addressing married men and women in all the churches? Great point. I think, of course they were. What about this one? Fornication. This is from Romans first chapter. So Paul notes that these wicked men leave their natural use of women, which suggests that they were married. Or if Paul means that they turned with their backs on marriage and sought an outlet for their sexual drive in homosexual relations instead, then are we to assume from this narrow definition of fornication that all these wicked men were unmarried? The betrothal definition would exclude married men from being viewed here. Here we go. So the Greek does not have a word for wife. So when Paul says even their women, this could be a reference to their wives who indulge in perverted sexual behavior. Were all these men and women unmarried? No, I don't think they were. Paul knew his Bible well. He knew that 23,000 men had been killed by a plague that God sent on them for committing fornication. Paul refers to this event as follows: neither let us commit premarital sex, fornication, as some of them committed, and fell in one day 23,000, 1 Corinthians 10:8. Is it credible to say that those 23,000 who died were all unmarried men? Is it more likely that the majority of the 23,000 were in fact married? Fifth, I'll do a couple more. Unless when I come again, my God will humble me among you, and that I shall bewail many of you who sinned already, and have not repented of the uncleanliness and premarital sex, or the fornication and the lasciviousness which they have committed. 2 Corinthians 12:21. It's credible to believe that those who sinned in Corinth were only the unmarried men. No. Again, Ephesians 5:5, same kind of thing. Mortify therefore yourselves. Colossians, only the single people should try to stay sexually pure. Everyone else, no problem. No, it doesn't make sense. This one's really strong. Jude, when meditating on the overthrow of Sodom and Gomorrah, wrote, even as Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities about them in like manner, giving themselves to premarital sex and going after strange flesh, are set forth as an example, suffering the vengeance of eternal fire. Are we to conclude from the solution's narrow definition of fornication, sin committed before marriage, that none of the men of Sodom and Gomorrah who committed this sin of fornication were married? The book of Revelation again. And so you can just see, I think that's pretty convincing. It says to extricate themselves, they have to assume that Jesus is referring to two wives, not one wife. Now, this is a little bit of change. One wife is the married wife, consummated, and the other wife is the engaged wife, unconsummated. The betrothal solution is the exception clause applies only to the engaged wife, while the rest of the verse applies to the fully married wife. What this solution overlooked was that the engaged wife who loses her virginity faces the death penalty. As we've seen time and time again. In this, I'm just reading it on because I'm still feeling like I'm a little bit confused, as maybe you are. In this short section, having examined 32 occurrences of the word fornication in the New Testament and picked out 10 of them where the distinction that the betrothal interpretation has given to the term fornication breaks down, and it's clear that one cannot restrict the sin of fornication to unmarried persons indulging in pre-marriage sex. This is a real hammer blow to the betrothal interpretation. So here we go. Here's in more like a visual. Consequently, when Jesus used the term fornication, he used it in its normal, non-specialized, general signification of unlawful sex, whether committed by married or unmarried persons. This undermines the betrothal interpretation, which requires that the term fornication can only refer to premarital sex. I guess one reason why I'm still a little bit confused is I'm having a tough time with, on the one hand, he feels like that the Erasmian Bible is not right, and it contains a except for fornication clause. And he goes on, he'll explain that he thinks what it should say is not even for fornication, meaning if I'm married and my wife has an affair, that I can't divorce her, not even for adultery, not even for fornication. So I know that's what he thinks. And he's making sure that, I guess he wants to make sure that the not even for fornication isn't just applied to engaged people. He thinks that it's really important for us married people to realize that even if we face the trial of adultery, that not even for that are we allowed to divorce and marry someone new. That's his position, but I'm just trying to see exactly how he gets there. So I hope that helps. We'll keep reading. The New King James translation of Matthew 19:9 reads, "And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery." Armed with the solid linguistic evidence that fornication is unlawful sex and can be attributed to married or unmarried persons, then logically the Erasmian exception clause means that Jesus taught that divorce was permissible for this sin. In other words, Jesus taught that divorce was permissible for adultery, which is fornication. This Erasmian conclusion was totally unacceptable to some Christians, and out of their consternation was born the betrothal interpretation, which depended upon rewriting the dictionary definition to suit their argument. It is true that a sign of desperation. It is truly a sign of desperation when one has to rewrite the dictionary to make fornication refer only to premarital sex and only performed by unmarried men and women. Interesting. Okay, so we're still moving on. I mean, so then the question is, I mean, should Mary have been executed? And the short answer is yes. This is assuming that she was sleeping around during her engagement. So, and then they explain why, but basically, it was kind of an error, a scandal, just to divorce her quietly, as Joseph tried to do. They talk a lot about Deuteronomy 22, which you can read on your own time. Obviously, I'm trying to give you guys the highlights. So in any case, we do not know when the divorce certificate came into use to end the betrothal contract, because we know that we cannot be sure what Joseph intended, except that it was to be done well away from the spotlight of publicity. Okay. So when did a divorce certificate become compulsory for betrothal divorce? The truth is we do not know. What we do know is that Moses never authorized it. We can trace the origin of Isaacson's misunderstanding of the acceptive clause to his understandable assumption that Matthew used the term divorce to describe Joseph's reaction to Mary's pregnant condition as a legal move on his part. He then read back into Joseph's marriage in 7 BC, something that we have no proof existed, namely that a divorce certificate was required to extract oneself from a betrothal marriage. So we simply have no proof that such a certificate or legal procedure existed in 7 BC. And he concedes that. So again, I highlighted this. The tide has turned with regard to marriage. The era when every Hebrew or Jewish man had to marry a virgin was past once the Messiah had arrived. Once the Messiah had arrived, the preference in the new era is that every follower of Christ, male and female, should not be married. They are more useful to Christ unmarried than married, because marriage distracts from full-time devotion to him. But he goes on, Jesus did not set himself up as a divorcer. His sights were set on bigger, more important goals. So he looked at the state of marriage among God's chosen people. He issued a severe warning to the Jews about the consequences of using divorce to get rid of their wives. And it goes on, Isaacson defends his betrothal interpretation of the accepted rule because it allows Jesus to maintain his teaching on the indissolubility of consummated marriages. And he gets around this by he gets around the absence of Matthew's acceptive clause in Mark and Luke by speculating that it was so self-evident that there was no need to repeat it each time the divorce logion was quoted. So that's why we don't see it in Matthew. That's what we don't see it in Luke. That's why we don't see it in, say, 1 Corinthians, according to this rationale. And he says it's obvious. We should all see it. But then he says a second explanation kind of undermines the it's obvious thing, which is his second explanation why the acceptive clause is not in Mark and Luke is to say that, quote, the question of the bride's virginity was not of such significance, since the exception mentioned in it in Matthew was not interpreted as being equally necessary as in the Jewish environment. Well, this negates his first explanation, which argued that the exception was self-evident, and therefore it was not necessary to repeat it for all the non-Jews. If anything, the exception would not be necessary to spell out for the Jews, for whom it was self-evident. The ones who most needed to know about the exception clause would be the non-Jews, and therefore it would have been in Mark and in Luke, and it would have been omitted in Matthew, because it was so self-evident to the Jews. Well, he goes on. Apart from the major problem that the except for fornication is translated in Erasmus's faulty Greek text, there's a problem with this limitation on Jesus' teaching. If the engaged couples are neglected as married, even though the consummation is still in the future, and they break off their official and very public engagement, much feasting by both family and friends, as Joseph planned to do with Mary, if this was done privately or secretly, does this mean that Mary is still technically a wife? And if so, the second half of Jesus' statement in 19:9b warns that anyone marrying a woman having been put away, for example, marrying Mary after Joseph had rejected her, is committing adultery by marrying her, ? And the answer would be no, and that the espousal period has been unilaterally terminated. So, again, this author, Leslie McFall, definitely again and again says these are two different things. A consummated marriage is not the same thing as an engagement to be married, simply put. So then the verb to put away, because we hear this sometimes, the verb to put away, you can see it here in Greek, is a very common verb with no technical or legal meaning to it. There is no equivalent in English to the English word divorce in Greek or Hebrew. So this verb to put away literally means what it says in every instance of its use in the New Testament. The exact same form of the verb is used when Jesus did not wish to send away the starving crowds. He didn't want to put them away. I mean, tell them to go away, get out of here. Or when Pilate wished to release Jesus, when he wanted to send him away, but he couldn't. And when the Roman judges wanted to release Paul from prison, send him out of prison. So there's nothing specific about divorce, marriage, or any of that when it comes to the verb to put away, and that's what he wants us to know. It's just that he put her away from his physical presence. He went to a different place. So the least that we can infer from the use of this common verb in this context is that Joseph made a decision to release Mary from her solemn commitment to marry him, physically putting a distance between him and her. It says God may not approve of the promiscuous life that precedes marriages in the West, but are we really to go so far as to declare that all marriages which were preceded by promiscuous behavior and lifestyle are invalid in the eyes of God? What about African tribal marriages before David Livingstone opened up Africa to Christian influence? Were all or some of these one-flesh unions invalid? Are not all civil marriages by godless persons, communists, atheists, etc., if lawfully entered into by first-timers, as valid as Christian marriages? The logic of 1 Corinthians 7:15 is that the unbelieving husband who departed from his Christian wife was still validly married to her. Somewhere lodged deep within the mind of untaught Christians is the human instinct that divorce does what it says it does, namely, it dissolves marriages. They know of divorced couples among their relations and friends, and divorce is a real fact of life. It says, indeed, the spiritual advice of Paul is worthy pondering very deeply. It is better not to touch a woman. But if you must, then choose only a Christian partner who truly bears fruit of being born again, because once you marry her, you're stuck with her for life, and vice versa. Jerome also wrote, as long as the husband is alive, even though he be an adulterer and is deserted by his wife for his crimes, he is still her husband, and she may not take another. So what's the alternative to the betrothal solution? First, we have shown that they use the Greek wrongly, and when they base their interpretation on Erasmus's Greek text. Second, those who first propounded the betrothal solution were duped by Erasmus into believing that Jesus made an exception for divorce in the case of fornication. To be tricked into accepting a Greek text which does not have a single Greek manuscript in support of its readings is a serious blow against any solution. Third, in order to maintain that Jesus never gave permission to dissolve a lawful marriage through a bill of divorce, the supporters of the betrothal interpretation were forced to restrict the meaning of fornication to unlawful sex performed by unmarried persons. This decision became the linchpin on which the whole theory would rest. The linguistic argument is seriously flawed. Fourth, they overlooked the fact that Mary's pregnant state before she married Joseph carried the death penalty from Deuteronomy. Fifth, it is constantly said that when Jesus said, except for fornication, he was referring to premarital sex during the Jewish spousal period before they came together. But if so, this means that Jesus overruled his father's law that such fornicating women were to be stoned. But on the betrothal view, Jesus reduced the penalty to divorce in the spousal period. This made Jesus to contradict his father. Sixth, and arising out of the above 5 points, if fornication can be committed by married persons, and the proponents of the betrothal view agree with Jesus that divorce can be had for fornication, then Jesus has permitted married persons to be legitimately divorced. There is no escaping this conclusion. Jesus supports what he's terming good divorces. It is no avail that the many defenders of the betrothal interpretation defend their position that the words except for it be for fornication refer to premarital sex during the Jewish spousal period before they, Mary and Joseph, came together. In other words, they do not regard Mary's sin as a death penalty crime, even though her case would come under Deuteronomy 22:23-27 by the populace who would be ignorant of the part of the Holy Spirit who played in making Mary pregnant. And in Deuteronomy 22:22, her crime is punished with death, not divorce. Anyway, this left the innocent partner free to marry another person. It is obvious that in this case, only one person was free to marry without being accused of adultery. It says, now if Mary and Joseph were considered to be husband and wife before they came together, then if either of them was sexually unfaithful to the other, it would be adultery. Now the Erasmian translation of Matthew 19:9 reads, and I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for fornication and marries another commits adultery. So what is this sin of fornication, which if a married woman commits, her husband is allowed to divorce her? Well, if fornication in this context means premarital sex during the spousal period by an unmarried person, then we have confusion, because in the context Jesus is talking about a wife who commits fornication, but this contradicts the betrothal definition of fornication, because Mary and Joseph could not commit fornication because they were regarded as husband and wife. This lack of joined-up thinking behind the solution has contributed to its confused presentation. And I said in the beginning, it's like, if you find this confusing, this author is saying it's confusing because it's illogical. And so it's not that we're not good at grammar, we don't understand, we can't follow an argument or something like that. It's that the pieces don't line up to make a logical argument. How can they be, truly man and wife and not be guilty of adultery? So you can't have it both ways. Do you want them to be man and wife, so that it applies to Matthew 19:9, talking of married people? You need them to be man and wife, truly. But then, if they're truly, then, it's adultery, fornication, all this other stuff. So, why does it say fornication? It says, since many Christians who hold that Jesus ruled out divorce for any reason have latched on to the betrothal interpretations as one that comes closest to Jesus' teaching condemning divorce or remarriage, it's worthwhile to repeat here how the so-called exception clause in Matthew 5:32 and 19:9 should be translated. And so they do a diagram here: Jewish law, death for fornication; non-sexual cases, divorce only for non-fornication. This is the Jewish law. This is the Greek and Roman law: divorce for sexual just go to court, But he says this is how it should really be said. Matthew 5:32, but I say to you that who say may put away his wife makes her to commit adultery, apart from the matter of her own fornication. And who say may marry her who has been put away commits adultery. Fornication here must have been committed after the marriage was consummated, otherwise the wife would have been stoned to death if she was not a virgin on her wedding night. The text is spelling out an exception to the verb makes as follows, but I say to you that who say may put away his wife makes her to commit adultery, apart from the matter of her own fornication, and who say may marry her who has been put away commits adultery. The use of this word makes it clear that the exception goes with the verb makes her to commit adultery, and not with the verb put away. So I guess you can still put her away, but you're not guilty of making her an adultery if she's done her own fornicating. The phrase not over fornication was intended to identify all non-fornication sins that had been used to obtain a divorce. It would make it even clearer if we translate the text as, and I say to you that who say may put away his wife for non-fornication cause may marry another, and may marry another commits adultery, and he who did marry her that has been put away commits adultery. So he says, since he's such a stickler for this not over fornication instead of except for fornication, he thinks this is a huge, massive deal. And he says the phrase not over fornication was intended to identify all non-fornication sins that had been used to obtain a divorce. So he's basically saying no divorce for, doesn't make enough money, went to jail, just doesn't make the other people a priority, whatever these things you hear on these marriage restoration blogs and stuff, Facebook pages. And they're saying that all that stuff doesn't matter. You can't divorce for that reason. But apparently it looks like you can, just as long as you don't remarry if your partner is fornicated against you. Jesus is totally focused on the unintended consequences that will follow anyone who divorces his wife, no matter what excuse he gives. So he says that was really the point. He was explaining what was going to happen. It follows that Jesus banned divorce for all non-capital offenses, and God banned divorce for all capital offenses. This then left the Pharisees with no grounds for divorce. So Jesus replied to the Pharisees. When he did that, he used a phrase that captured every excuse that a Jew could use to get a divorce from his wife, namely, not over fornication. He could not have made himself clear where he stood in the absolute minimum of words, for it was only 3 words in Greek, as it is in English. Not over fornication. So despite Western reservations over the manner in which Jesus defined every cause in the Pharisees' question, the mathematical precision and logic of Jesus' position on divorce was instantly recognized and understood by the Pharisees to mean that there were no causes left to get a divorce. If 1, they could not get one for fornication or adultery because God demanded the death penalty for these cases, and 2, if Jesus had just removed getting a divorce for any non-fornication cause. Anyway, it goes on. However, they would not be outdone by this man from nowhere, this backwater prophet, self-proclaimed rabbi. They had Moses, and they knew what Moses said, and so they said, we've got this Jesus guy right where we want him. We're just going to go and quote some Moses to him, and we'll show him to be wrong. They had to wait until they got Jesus along out of sight of the Pharisees before they could question him over his brand new teaching on divorce and remarriage. See, brand new. See, I'm not the only one that thinks it's different than before. It is different. He did change some things. So, but his disciples were asking him. Jesus' position of not over fornication clearly ruled out divorce for any non-capital offense. Again, lost your job or whatever, got fat, whatever. Which adultery, so all the non-capital offenses, which adultery and fornication clearly were. So if it is not possible to get a lawful divorce on the grounds of adultery or fornication, then what grounds were left to get a divorce? And Jesus' answers was none. The answer he gave behind closed doors was the same he gave in the public square. Moses had never given the Jews the right to divorce an espoused wife. This was a tradition of the patriarchs that predated the Exodus. Moses merely conceded that divorce, like the poor, would always be with Israel. When the Pharisees asked their question, they and Jesus were focused on the issue whether a consummated marriage could be dissolved. Jesus' answer had come to terms with that issue and not stray off into the legitimacy of broken betrothal contracts. We must be clear in our minds that Moses did not approve of divorce. His sole contribution was to force the husband to write out a bill of divorce when he divorced his wife. Moses was a realist, and he knew what he was up against, and to ban divorce altogether was impossible. The best he could do was to sharpen the husband's oral decision to throw out his wife by forcing him to give her a written form of his oral decision, so that his action would be set in a permanent form for all time to come. Unknown to the divorcer, it would become his own spiritual death certificate that he was writing out. They had in mind that it was probably lawful. He's talking to Jesus and the Pharisees. They had it in mind that it was probably lawful from the way they read Deuteronomy 24, 1-4. But Jesus does not get into an argument with them over the legitimacy of their exegesis of Deuteronomy, whether it was descriptive or prescriptive. He goes straight to the engine that is the driving force behind all divorces, an unwillingness to forgive others their sins. He calls it hard-heartedness. The logic of this position is that if hard-heartedness did not exist, then divorce would not exist. They need each other. They feed off each other. This is a shame to find hard-heartedness in any Christian. It is a denial that Christ lives in them. Hard-heartedness belongs to the old man, to the old nature. which every Christian is called upon to crucify daily. Many evangelicals pass this off as an ideal and unrealistic aspiration and fall back to their pre-born again days and divorce their spouse in the law courts of Satan, having convinced themselves to their own satisfaction that they were left no other option. By opting to get a divorce, they seal themselves in their own sin, which will ultimately eat away into every fiber of their physical and spiritual bodies like a cancer. They will walk in darkness for the rest of their lives and be rejected in the day of judgment as one of a vast horde of human beings who did not forgive others their sins, and consequently their sins could not be forgiven them by a righteous God, who is no respecter of persons, be they archbishops or successful missionaries or professors of theology. In conclusion, this critique is found in the Betrothal View wanting in the following areas. You can read it here. We've gone over it already. Again, this whole thing is built upon the wrong understanding, the wrong Greek text of Erasmus. This is the whole problem anyway, to try to understand except for fornication when it should be not for her own fornication. As it says here, Matthew 5:32, but I say to you that who say, put away his wife, makes her to commit adultery, apart from the matter of her own fornication, and who say, may marry her who has been put away, commits adultery. Matthew 19:9, and I say to you, the content identity phrase, or the remainder clause. And I say to you that who say, put away his wife, not over fornication, which is punishable by death, and may marry another commits adultery, and he who did marry her that has been put away commits adultery. These translations bring the teaching of Jesus in Mark and Luke in line with Matthew. All three Gospels are sending out the same message to Jews and Gentiles alike, that divorce has been abolished from the face of the earth for all time to come. To divorce anyone for any reason is not, if not repented of, will exclude that person from entering the kingdom of God. This critique of the betrothal interpretation shows that it is possible to hold a high view of the inspiration and infallibility of Scripture, and at the same time show that Jesus made no exception for divorce on any grounds. This work sets out a biblical alternative to the betrothal interpretation. It is a biblical alternative to the many competing interpretations that would introduce divorce into Christ's church on the back of Erasmus's tampering with Jesus' words in Matthew 19:9. It is a biblical alternative to move back to the church, to following the teaching. It is a biblical alternative to the move to turn back the church to follow the teaching of the rabbis on divorce and remarriage, which some evangelical teachers and writers are pressing for. So that's it. Hope you guys liked it. It was long, eh? It was pretty interesting. Pretty interesting stuff. The Betrothal View, covered by Leslie McFall, who wrote a lot. I tried to condense it. I probably didn't do that great. But when you hear people say, oh, I'm in the betrothal camp, or, I'm allowed to get remarried, or blah, 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 now you have a good insight. You can always go back and watch this video whenever you like. You can always read this article on your own anytime you like. I'll leave the link for you in the description. I hope that you can subscribe, support the channel financially if you could. We don't have any financial supporters yet on Patreon, so maybe you could be the first, or maybe, hopefully by the time you see this, there's many already. I am considering discontinuing this channel or seriously cutting it back. It just hasn't seemed to be that it's got that much traction. Maybe it's, I don't know, people don't like this kind of stuff, or maybe there's a lot of other people that are doing it much better than I am. I don't know, but this is a great article. Thanks for joining me for it, and we'll talk to you next time.